2 billion people make tea every morning. They think it's their choice, their habit, their small personal ritual. They're wrong. That habit was engineered, designed, installed, and maintained by force across 2 centuries by the largest empire in human history. Britain didn't just trade tea. It used tea as an instrument of control over entire peoples, as a weapon in wars, as a mechanism for extracting wealth from half the planet. One leaf, from one plant, and it reshaped the geopolitics of the world so deeply that we still live in the world it created. What if tea had never existed? No Opium Wars, no British India as it actually was, no Boston Tea Party, and possibly no American Revolution in 1776. All of this from the leaves of a bush that grew wild in the mountains of Yunnan, while the rest of the world didn't know it existed. The leaf that conquered China. The history of tea begins with a legend too beautiful not to believe. 2737 BC. The Chinese Emperor Shennong, the legendary divine farmer, credited with inventing agriculture and medicine, sits beneath a tree boiling water. Several leaves fall into the pot. The water changes color. The smell is pleasant. He tastes it. That is how tea was born. Whether true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that tea appeared in China so long ago that its origin dissolved into myth. By the 3rd century AD, it was an ordinary drink. By the 7th century, under the Tang dynasty, it had become a national obsession. The poet Lu Yu wrote The Classic of Tea, an exhaustive treatise on growing, processing, brewing, and the philosophy of tea. This was not a cookbook. It was a cultural manifesto. In China, tea was not simply a beverage. It was a philosophy. The tea ceremony demanded a particular state of mind, stillness, attentiveness, full presence in the moment. It was bound up with Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. To drink tea properly was to practice a certain way of existing in the world. From China, tea spread along the Silk Road in every direction, and what happened to it along the way reveals something remarkable about human adaptability. Mongolian warriors on the steppes drank tea boiled with milk and salt, pressed into hard bricks that could survive months on horseback and be shaved off and brewed anywhere. Tibetans developed their own version, tea churned with yak butter and salt into a thick, calorie-dense drink that provided warmth and energy at altitudes where little else grew. The same leaf, the same plant, transformed into something completely different by every culture that touched it. Tea didn't spread as a finished product. It spread as a raw material that each civilization remade in its own image. This is what made it unstoppable. From China, tea reached Japan in the 9th century, and there became an even more rigorous ritual. The Japanese tea ceremony, chanoyu, was so precisely elaborated that its study took years. Every movement, every gesture, every object carried meaning. It was meditation in the form of a drink. When 16th century Portuguese traders first brought tea samples to Europe, they faced a puzzle. How do you sell something nobody has ever tasted, grown on the other side of the world, costing extraordinary sums, requiring a special ritual to consume properly. The Dutch found the answer, and it changed everything. How an empire built a habit. The Dutch East India Company began importing tea to Europe regularly in the early 17th century. Initially, it was a curious pharmaceutical product, sold as a remedy for everything from headaches to gout, melancholy to digestive problems. The price was astronomical. Then Britain took over and approached it with characteristic practicality. In 1660, Charles II returned to the English throne from exile in the Netherlands, bringing with him not only Dutch financial practices, but a Dutch taste for tea. His wife, Catherine of Braganza from Portugal, made tea fashionable at court. The aristocracy followed the Queen. The middle classes followed the aristocracy. Everyone else followed the middle classes. But this was not spontaneous popularity. It was a managed campaign. The British East India Company, one of the first and most powerful corporations in history, held a monopoly on the tea trade with China. The company had a direct financial interest in ensuring that as many British people as possible drank as much tea as possible. It lobbied for tariff reductions. It financed the tea clippers, the fastest ships of their era. It created advertising long before the word itself existed. The tea clippers deserve a moment. These were the Formula One cars of the 19th century, the most technologically advanced vessels ever built, designed for one purpose: to get Chinese tea to London faster than the competition. The hulls were narrow and sharp. The masts carried extraordinary quantities of sail. The crews were paid bonuses for speed. In 1866, 3 clippers, the Taiping, the Ariel, and the Serica, left the Chinese port of Fuzhou on the same tide, raced 99 days across 2 oceans, covering 16,000 miles, and arrived in London within 28 minutes of each other. 28 minutes. After 3 months at sea, the nation followed the race like a sporting event. Tea had created the fastest ships in history. By 1800, tea accounted for 10% of all revenue flowing into the British Treasury. 10% from leaves. Everyone drank it. Factory workers, because water boiled for tea was safer than contaminated urban water, and because sugar in tea provided quick calories for brutal physical labor. Aristocrats, because the afternoon tea ritual demonstrated refinement. The army, because a tea ration became part of standard British military provisions. That afternoon tea ritual deserves its own moment. In 1840, Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, began requesting that a tray of tea, bread, and cakes be brought to her rooms at around 4 in the afternoon. The long gap between the light midday meal and the fashionable late dinner had become, as she put it, a sinking feeling. She began inviting friends to join her. The habit spread. Within a decade, afternoon tea had become one of the defining social rituals of Victorian England. But afternoon tea did something else that nobody had planned. The tea rooms that sprang up across Britain to serve this ritual became, almost by accident, the first truly public spaces where women could go unaccompanied by a male relative without social censure. A woman could enter a tea room alone, meet friends, conduct business, spend hours in public, none of which she could do in a pub, a coffee house, or most restaurants of the era. Afternoon tea quietly expanded the boundaries of what respectable women were permitted to do in public. It was a small revolution in a teacup. The habit was created. Now it had to be maintained. Opium for tea. This is where the history of tea becomes the history of one of the greatest state crimes of the modern era. By the late 18th century, Britain had a problem, a massive, expensive, structural problem. The British wanted Chinese tea in enormous quantities. China wanted almost nothing Britain produced in return. Silver, that was what China wanted. And silver was flowing from Britain to China in a torrent, creating a colossal trade deficit. The British East India Company found a solution in opium. The company controlled opium production in Bengal, the Indian province it had by then effectively occupied. Opium was grown by Indian peasants under conditions of forced labor, processed in company factories, and smuggled into China aboard merchant vessels. The Chinese government repeatedly banned opium imports. British traders, with the tacit support of the government, ignored the bans. By the 1830s, China had approximately 12 million opium addicts. The silver began flowing back toward Britain. In 1839, the Chinese official Lin Zezhu destroyed a massive warehouse of confiscated British opium, around 20,000 chests. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience. Surely Britain, which banned opium at home, could not consider it acceptable to sell it to the Chinese. Queen Victoria did not reply. Instead, Britain sent the Navy. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 was, in essence, a war for the right to sell narcotics. British warships bombarded Chinese coastal cities, Canton, Amoy, Ningbo, Shanghai, with a firepower that Chinese defenders had no means to resist. When British troops stormed the forts at Canton, they found the Chinese soldiers had tied themselves to their posts rather than flee. They died at their guns. It made no difference. The gap in technology was simply too wide. Lin Zezhu, the man who had written to the Queen, who had destroyed the opium, who had tried to stop what was happening, was blamed by the Chinese government for provoking the war. He was exiled to the remote northwestern frontier, thousands of miles from the coast he had tried to defend. He died in 1850 without seeing the full consequences of what he had tried to prevent. Under the Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, China was forced to open 5 ports to British trade, pay a massive indemnity, and cede Hong Kong. The Second Opium War followed, from 1856 to 1860. British and French troops burned and looted the old Summer Palace in Beijing, one of the greatest acts of cultural destruction of the 19th century. All of this so that the British could continue drinking tea without bankrupting the treasury. The Chinese call this period the Century of Humiliation. It lasted from the Opium Wars to 1949 and remains one of the primary sources of Chinese national trauma that shapes the country's foreign policy to this day. The tensions between China and the Western world that we observe now trace their roots there, to the years when Britain went to war for the right to trade narcotics in exchange for tea. India as a tea plantation. The Opium Wars solved the trade deficit problem. They did not solve the problem of dependence on Chinese supply. If China closed its market again, the entire system would collapse. Britain made a decision: grow its own tea, on its own land, under its own control. The land was India. In 1823, a British officer named Robert Bruce discovered wild tea plants growing in the jungles of Assam. The East India Company immediately began establishing plantations. Seeds and cuttings were smuggled out of China. Chinese tea masters were lured or coerced into transferring their processing knowledge. By the mid-19th century, Assam tea was being produced on an industrial scale. But the British weren't content with Assam alone. On the island of Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, an even more dramatic transformation was underway. Ceylon had been a major coffee producer, supplying much of Europe's demand. Then, in 1869, a fungal disease called Himalaya vastatrix, coffee leaf rust, arrived on the island and within 15 years destroyed almost the entire coffee industry. Plantations that had taken generations to build were wiped out in a decade. The British response was ruthless and efficient. Replace coffee with tea. Entire hillsides were cleared and replanted. A new infrastructure of roads, railways, and processing factories was built. Scottish planters arrived to manage the new estates. By 1900, Ceylon had become one of the world's leading tea producers. Today, as Sri Lanka, the island still produces around 300 million kilograms of tea annually. The entire shape of its economy, the look of its central highlands, the livelihoods of millions of its people, all of it traces back to that fungal outbreak of 1869 and the British decision to pivot from one crop to another. Both in Assam and Ceylon, the plantations required labor, enormous amounts of it. The solution was familiar: coerced labor of imported workers. The system was called gurmatiyas. Poor peasants were bound to plantations by multi-year contracts, lived in barracks, received wages barely sufficient for survival, and were forbidden from leaving without permission. Attempting to escape meant prison. The system was enshrined in law and enforced by colonial police. It existed until 1926. The system disappeared. The economics did not. Today, India, China, Kenya, and Sri Lanka produce around 70% of the world's tea. Most tea pickers earn below the living wage. A cup of expensive single estate tea in a London cafe costs hundreds of times more than the person who picked it earns in a day. Some things don't change. Only their names do. The leaf that made America. December 16th, 1773, Boston Harbor. A group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. The total value of the destroyed cargo, approximately 10,000 pounds sterling. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. and it was not simply a protest against taxes. To understand what happened, you need the context. The British Parliament taxed tea sold to the colonies, and this was not fundamentally about the money. It was about the principle. A parliament in which the colonists had no representation was setting the rules by which they had to live. No taxation without representation was not a slogan. It was a political conviction. But there was another layer. The East India Company had been granted the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing local merchants, which meant financial ruin for the American tea merchants who had built their businesses on Dutch contraband. Among the organizers of the Boston Tea Party were wealthy traders whose commercial existence was under threat. The revolution that created the United States was made of both idealism and self-interest, tangled together as revolutions usually are. The man who turned the destruction of tea into a political weapon was Samuel Adams, one of the most skilled political operators in American history. Adams understood that what happened in Boston Harbor needed to be immediately framed as an act of principled resistance rather than a riot or a criminal act. He controlled the narrative from the moment the last chest hit the water. The participants were sworn to secrecy. Their identities were protected for decades. The event was presented to the public as a spontaneous uprising of free citizens against tyranny. It worked. Britain responded hard, closing the port, stripping Massachusetts of self-government. These measures united the colonies against the mother country more effectively than anything before them. 2 years later, the Revolutionary War began. 7 years after that, the United States came into existence. And in the new republic, the choice of what to drink became a political statement that persisted for generations. Americans who had thrown tea into the harbor and fought a war partly over the right to buy it from whoever they chose, now deliberately chose coffee instead. It was an act of identity, a daily declaration of independence. The United States became a coffee nation not entirely by accident or preference, but because tea had become the drink of the empire they had just defeated. That association has never entirely faded. The United States today consumes more coffee than any other country on earth. Every morning, in every city, the ghost of 1773 is still being enacted, 1 cup at a time. Finale. A world without tea. No opium wars. No century of humiliation that still shapes Chinese foreign policy and explains much of the tension between China and the West that we see today. British India was built for many reasons, but without the tea plantations of Assam and Ceylon, it would have looked different. The Boston Tea Party would not have happened, and the American Revolution, if it came at all, would have come for different reasons, at a different time, possibly with a different outcome. 1 leaf. From a bush that grew wild in the mountains of Yunnan. But here is what matters more than any of this history. Tea taught us something about power that we prefer not to notice. The most effective control over people is not the kind applied by force. It is the kind that people accept voluntarily because it has become their daily habit.
The British Empire didn't force people to drink tea at gunpoint.
It simply made tea available, normal, necessary. And through that habit, it controlled trade routes, colonial economies, and ultimately the fates of entire peoples. 2 billion cups a day, every day. You think this is your choice, but the habits that feel most personal are often the most carefully engineered.